The first thing Silas saw, piercing the dusty half-light of his old barn, was a shock of raven-black hair spread across pale straw, a violent smear of ink across parchment. Just beneath it, a blossom of deep crimson was unfurling across worn buckskin, blooming like a blood flower in the silence. His heart, a creature long trained to beat, with the dull, lonely rhythm of isolation, kicked hard against his ribs like a startled mule. For a long, breathless moment, he simply stood there, the door creaking behind him, dust hanging like old ghosts in the air. A girl, a Navajo girl, wounded, maybe dying. She lay as though she'd fallen from the sky, some fractured star spat out by a world of pain and violence, a world Silas had spent years trying to outrun. He hadn't spoken to another soul in weeks, months, maybe, and yet the sight of her so fragile, so terribly out of place in the quiet sanctum of his barn, pulled at something in him that he had buried beneath layers of silence and self-recrimination. This wasn't just a trespass, this was a rupture, and the kindness he'd locked away long ago, the one thing that had nearly destroyed him, came alive like a spark striking dry brush. Silas hadn't always been a ghost. Once, he had been known feared, even a bounty hunter with calloused hands, a rifle that never missed, and a name that made desperate men flinch. But one child, one mistake, one final scream he hadn't meant to cause, and the legend of Silas Cade had ridden off into exile, deep into this broken valley surrounded by dying grass and unfinished apologies. His days were predictable, routine, the comfort of repetition disguised as penitence. He patched fences in the morning sun, fed the cattle with methodical hands, fixed what didn't matter anymore. His voice had grown hoarse from disuse, a dry croak reserved only for his horse, Buck, or the occasional curse spat at the relentless wind. And yet, despite the hard shell he'd built around himself, the land still had its whispers. He knew it intimately, its moods, its warning signs, the sudden hush before a dust storm, the faint bend of a thorn bush when something watched from the ridge. Today, though, the land had been too quiet, not a warning, but a hush of anticipation, like the pause before a prayer. Now, he knew why. He moved forward slowly, every bootstep stirring the straw, shadow stretching long under the slanted afternoon light. She didn't move. Her body was still except for the jagged rise and fall of her breath. Her skin, under the grime and blood, held that fierce kind of desert beauty, sharp lines, dark lashes, copper skin flushed with fever. A makeshift bandage wrapped around her arm was soaked through, and a darker stain bled from her side. Gunshot, most likely, fresh and deep. Silas crouched beside her. The scent of hay mingled with iron and sweat. He reached out, calloused fingers brushing against her temple. Her skin was fire, fever, already burning through her like summer lightning. Her eyes fluttered open. For a moment, they were glazed, lost in pain and sky. But then they sharpened with a flash of fear, primal and wild. She looked at him the way a cornered doe looks at the hunter, braced for the final blow. He pulled his hand back, not from threat, but from shame, because in that second, he saw himself reflected in her terror, and he remembered what it felt like to have nothing left but breath and fear. Whatever danger she'd bring, whoever might be tracking her, it no longer mattered. He couldn't leave her here. He couldn't walk away. With a gentleness that would have stunned anyone who'd once known him, Silas gathered the girl into his arms. She was light, too light, bones and blood and silence. Her head rested against his chest, and for the first time in years, the rhythm of his heart changed. The short walk from the barn to the cabin felt longer than any trail he'd ever ridden, not because of her weight, but because of what she carried with her, something he couldn't name yet, but felt deep in the hollow space behind his ribs. He laid her down on his bed, a narrow cot, long untouched by warmth. The blankets looked rough against her skin, the whole room bare walls, faded photos. The fireplace with its cold ashes felt suddenly inadequate, like a shrine abandoned too long. He moved quickly, without speaking. The kettle hissed over the hearth. The sharp scent of carbolic soap filled the air. He washed the wound with steady hands, even as sweat slicked his back. Blood, bruises, old ones and new. Whoever had done this hadn't just tried to kill her. They'd meant to erase her. He tore strips from his own shirt, the one Martha had sewn for him years ago, and bound her with care. Each touch was deliberate, his hands trembling only when she moaned, slipping into fevered sleep. Outside, the wind shifted. A hawk cried far above the ridge. Inside, the cabin held its breath. Silas sat beside her through the night. Once, she stirred and muttered something in a language he didn't know, but the tone, the melody, was soft. A lullaby, maybe. A prayer to ancestors. Or perhaps a goodbye. But she didn't. She held on. And so did he. Not because he had to, not because he owed the world any more good deeds, but because for the first time in years, he wanted to. Not to erase what he'd done, but to protect what he hadn't yet lost. For 3 days and nights, fever held Lila in its brutal grip. Silas barely slept. His world, once anchored by silence and solitude, had narrowed to the shape of a narrow cot, the sound of shallow, ragged breathing, and the unbearable heat radiating from her skin. The woman Lila had become the center of everything, and he didn't know how it had happened. She murmured in a tongue he couldn't understand, sometimes soft like wind through canyon grass, sometimes sharp and broken like bones beneath boots. Words of pain, maybe fear. Once or twice she flinched from him, arms jerking in weakness, and he'd step back quickly, muttering nonsense in the low, soothing voice he used for spooked colts. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes she simply drifted further from consciousness, caught in whatever nightmare gripped her. Silas had never nursed anyone before. His care was clumsy, instinctive. He boiled water, cleaned the festering wound in her side, changed bandages he tore from his own shirts. His hands, which had once drawn guns with lethal ease, now shook as they brushed sweat from her brow. The fever came and went in waves. When it peaked, she shook with eyes rolling, jaw clenched, her back arching slightly in pain. He held her through those moments, whispering whatever came to mind. Fragments of old cowboy ballads, prayers he no longer believed in, the name she had not yet told him. By the 5th night, he knew the rhythms of her breath better than his own. Every gasp, every twitch of her fingers, mapped into his brain like the creases in his saddle. He didn't know what had happened to him, only that he hadn't cared this deeply for another living soul in years, maybe ever. And yet, the danger of her presence hung heavy in the room. She wasn't just wounded, she was hunted. And by choosing to help her, Silas had made himself part of the hunt. He kept his Winchester within reach, checked the latch on the door twice each night, scanned the horizon more often than before, his instincts slowly stirring awake after years of self-imposed stillness. That old tracker's awareness, dulled by grief and time, was sharpening again, not just for himself, but for her. Then, like a summer thunderstorm, the fever broke sudden and absolute. She cried out once, low and hoarse, then went still. A slick of sweat coated her brow. Her chest rose, slower now, more even. And when her eyes opened, there was no more fog in them, only clarity, wariness, and something else he couldn't name. They said nothing for hours. He brought her water from the creek. She drank it slowly, with shaking hands. When he offered rabbit stew later, she managed a few bites before sleep took her again, less fevered this time. Healing. She was still weak the next day, but strong enough to sit up, to touch the wound at her side with a wince of recognition. Her gaze followed him now, watchful, questioning. He wasn't sure what she saw when she looked at him. A stranger, a savior, a threat, maybe all three. He didn't know what to say. He never did, even in the best of time. So he pointed at himself. "Silas," he said. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Then, very softly, she whispered, "Silas?" He nodded. Then, hesitantly, he pointed toward her. Silence. But that night, as the wind rustled through the sagebrush beyond the cabin walls, she said it quiet and deliberate. Lila. The name settled between them like smoke, delicate, but real. A bridge across a canyon neither of them had chosen, but both now had to cross. From that moment, something shifted. He began leaving small things near her cot. A hawk feather he found at the creek bed, a smooth, oval-shaped river stone, a handful of late-season wild berries. He expected nothing, just small gestures, the only language he had left. But one day, he saw her turning the feather between her fingers, her eyes distant, thoughtful. A soft smile flickered across her lips, there and gone like a hummingbird's wing. He felt warmth bloom in his chest, foreign and unsettling. The peace, however, was brittle. A few days later, while checking the northern ridge, Silas found signs subtle but undeniable. Tracks, boot prints, droppings from horses trained to travel long and fast. No campfires, no smoke. These men knew how to move without leaving a trace. They hadn't approached the cabin yet, but they were near. Thorn was coming. Silas's body moved before his thoughts caught up. He oiled his rifle, checked the cartridges twice, began locking the barn at night, setting traps at the tree line, revisiting hiding places he hadn't used in years. His boots left faint marks through the valley soil, but those he made sure to erase behind him. He didn't speak of it to Lila. He didn't need to. She felt it too. She watched him more closely. When he returned from scouting, she'd meet his eyes and hold the gaze, silent, steady. There was fear in her, but not of him, of what was coming, and perhaps of what she might have to do again to survive. That evening, she sat by the hearth, mending a tear in her dress with surprising grace. Her fingers moved with memory. Someone had taught her this long ago. Silas leaned by the window, his rifle across his lap, listening to the hush of wind outside and the subtle creak of wood under tension. Then 3 knocks, sharp, imperative. They sliced through the noon stillness like a gunshot. Lila froze. The needle slipped from her hand, clinking softly on the floorboards. Her head snapped toward the door. Her breath caught in her throat. Her eyes wide, locked onto Silas's. He raised a hand slowly, a finger to his lips. Then, with his other hand, he pointed toward the curtained alcove where she'd been sleeping. She disappeared behind it without a sound, vanishing like smoke. Silas exhaled. His fingers closed around the rifle's grip, the wood worn smooth with time. He moved to the door, cracked it open, and sunlight glanced off 5 mounted men. Their horses stamped restlessly in the dirt. Dust clung to their coats like ghosts. At the center sat a tall man with pale, flat eyes and a neatly trimmed beard. His coat was clean, his saddle polished, but there was no softness in him, just a predator's stillness. Captain Malachi Thorn, and he had come knocking. Thorn wore a cavalry coat, brass buttons shining like teeth in the midday sun, but there was no soldier's honor in the way he sat a horse, nor in the way his pale eyes roamed. He was a man dressed in borrowed dignity, and beneath the fabric, only hunger and calculation remained. "Afternoon," he said smoothly, as if stopping by for coffee. "We're searching for a Navajo girl. Dangerous fugitive. Caused quite a bit of trouble not far from here. Lee." Silas leaned against the doorframe, boots planted firm, his face as unreadable as weathered stone. "Haven't seen any Navajo," he said. "Just me. Been quiet here." Thorn smiled, a thin, reptilian curl of the mouth. "This one's wounded," he said. "Couldn't have gotten far." His gaze slipped past Silas's shoulder, lingering too long on the barn behind him, trying to pierce the gloom. He was already trespassing with his eyes. Behind him, Cutter, a hulking brute with a scar that cut across his face like an old wound that never learned to heal, spat a line of tobacco close enough to Silas's boots to insult. "She's slippery," he grunted, "but we always finish what we start." Silas's hand rested lightly on the edge of the door, near where his Winchester leaned. He didn't move, didn't blink. "This is my land," he said, "and I told you, I haven't seen her." Thorn's smile faded by a fraction. When he spoke again, his voice was velvet, rapping something sharp. "A man living alone. It's a hard life. Easy for things to go wrong. Real easy for a man to disappear." He let the threat hang like smoke. "Just a quick look around," Thorn added, light again, but the menace never left his eyes. "We won't touch a thing." Silas's eyes narrowed. "Cold. Flint. Look all you want," he said, "but you stay out of my cabin and out of my barn." Thorn held his stare for a beat too long. Then he nodded curtly. "As you wish, rancher. For now." They rode off, slow and deliberate, fanning out along the ridgeline as if they owned it. Their search was brief, almost casual, but every hoofprint was a mark, a reminder. Silas stood still long after they'd gone, jaw locked tight. The wind stirred his coat. He felt the fire rise inside him, low and coiling. He'd seen this before. Men like Thorne didn't ask twice. They took, and they'd be back. He was right. 3 days later, he smelled the smoke before he saw it. Up on the north slope, the pasture he'd set aside for winter grazing was blackened to ash. The fence was gone, grass seared to nothing. A message, written in fire. A warning. They suspected. Or worse, they didn't care. Either way, they wanted him to know. They were watching. That night, Lila spoke. Her voice was fragile but clear, shaped by effort and pain. She sat beside the hearth, blanket over her shoulders, the flickering light painting bronze across her cheeks. "They killed my family," she said, "for what we protected." Silas didn't interrupt. He only watched her. "My grandfather," she continued slowly, "was a storyteller, a guardian, keeper of the way to the moonlit hollow, a sacred place. For the Navajo." She said the name in her own tongue first, then repeated it, softly, as if translating something not meant to be said aloud. "A place of healing, of quiet, of memory. We do not speak its name unless we must." Her voice dropped. Thorne believed there was gold. Silas swallowed hard. "I told my grandfather to run," she said. "But he stayed. He said the land needed a voice, that the old songs would protect us." She paused. The flames crackled in the hearth. "But songs don't stop, Bullet." Her fists clenched in her lap. Not a single tear fell, but her silence carried the weight of loss heavier than any sob. "He was tortured," she said flatly. "He never spoke, not even when they—" She stopped, closed her eyes. "I ran because someone had to remember, not to survive to remember." She looked at him then. There was no plea in her eyes, no begging, but there was a weight, a quiet, wordless question. "What will you do now that you know?" Silas didn't answer right away. The smell of scorched earth still clung to his coat. He could feel the blackened fence posts in his memory, standing like bone. "I won't let them take you," he said finally. Simple, honest, and heavier than a promise. Lila didn't smile, but her shoulders eased, just barely, and that was enough. In the days that followed, they worked. Silas cleared new fire breaks, hauled stones to strengthen the perimeter, rerouted water from the creek. His body ached, but his mind was sharp again, sharper than it had been in years. Every movement had purpose now. Lila moved alongside him, quieter, smaller, but just as steady. She carried water, stacked kindling, tended the fire like she had grown up with it in her bones. Her gaze was different now, no longer wary, but watchful, focused. They spoke little, but between them, something was being built. Not just defenses, but understanding. A rhythm, a shared urgency. At dusk, she sometimes walked the edge of the bluff overlooking the western valley, her dark hair loose, her figure outlined against the dying light. Silas watched her from the porch, not with longing, but with something deeper, respect, and the sharp ache of knowing he couldn't protect her from everything. But he would try. Every night now, he loaded his rifle with ritual precision, cleaned it, laid it by the door. The air felt different, tighter, the calm before lightning. One night, as the sky turned a dusky red and the pines whispered warnings, Lila turned to him. "If they come," she said, "we do not run." Silas looked at her, really looked. There was nothing fragile in her now, only fire. "We don't run," he agreed. And for the first time in years, he felt ready. She was wounded, yes, but she carried more than pain. Not a map drawn on hide, but something older, deeper, the sacred knowledge of a canyon etched into her memory with the clarity of dreams. A place not meant for gold or conquest, but for silence, for breath, for healing. And tucked in the folds of her woven sash, she carried the last remnant of that world. A small medicine bundle, wrapped in deerskin, tied with blue-dyed thread, and worn soft by generations of prayer. Inside it were pieces of her, her mother's whisper, her grandfather's song, the smell of sage, the drumbeat of the land before fire took it all. As Silas listened, rage, cold and familiar, crawled up his spine. He had known this kind of greed before, back when he was still young and wearing the blue. back when he rode with scouts who translated treaties for bullets. He remembered the village in the canyon, remembered the smoke, the cries. A Navajo elder blind in one eye, still singing until the singing was cut short. He had watched it all and done nothing, and that shame had been poison ever since. That was why he'd left, why he'd buried himself in this quiet, between fences and horses, trying to pretend the world had nothing more to demand of him. But now, it had found him again. It had found her. He looked at Lila, at the way her eyes burned, not with hatred, but with defiance. At how she sat straight, even with pain in her ribs and bruises on her arms. She wasn't a fugitive. She was a flame still burning in the ashes of everything they'd tried to take from her. This wasn't just about hiding her anymore. This was about reckoning. The quiet rancher, the man who had sworn to forget, felt something ancient stir in his chest. The scout, the survivor, the man who had once navigated war like breath. The instincts had never died. They'd just been waiting. "He won't find it," Silas said, his voice rough as gravel, "and he won't take you." His hand moved, without thinking reached across the rough-hewn table and covered hers. It was a brief touch, but something sparked, not just warmth, but recognition. Her eyes widened slightly, not in fear, but surprise. Then something else flickered behind them, a quiet acknowledgement, not of romance, but of shared fire. When he pulled back, the air between them had changed. The cabin, once a tomb, now felt charged, not just with danger, but with purpose. They both knew. Thorn would return. Pride wouldn't let him walk away empty. Greed would drag him back like a noose. So Silas and Lila began to prepare, not in panic but with calm, grim purpose. The ranch would become more than a home. It would become a fortress, not just of logs and stone, but of two people refusing to vanish quietly. Silas's memory of every ridge, every rabbit trail, every angle of sunlight became their blueprint. Lila's instincts, honed in the high desert, filled in the rest. She showed him how to blend into shadows, how to scatter dried leaves over trails to muffle movement, how to smell when the wind shifted in warning. He, in turn, taught her how to shoot, not just aim, but feel the weapon, how to hold steady in wind, how to count seconds between reloads. She learned quickly. Woodpiles became breastworks. Loose stones were rearranged into silent traps. The creek bed was channeled into a kill zone. A high rock outcrop became a sniper's perch. They worked from dawn until long after dusk. Sometimes their hands brushed, fingers grazing over rifle barrels or stones. Sometimes their eyes met across the field, both lined with dirt and sweat and something unnamed. Silas noticed how a strand of Lila's hair would always slip free of her braid and kiss her cheek. He noticed how she didn't complain, not even once, even when her bandages bled through. He watched the way she moved, not with grace, but with resilience, with intention. And she noticed him too, how his eyes, always shadowed, softened when they landed on her. How his voice, usually gravelly and spare, became quieter when he handed her food. How his strength didn't shout, it just was. Something stirred between them, a tension neither dared name, not desire, not yet, but something older, the kind of bond formed not by words, but by standing back to back in the face of thunder. On the fifth morning, the wind shifted. Lila's hand landed gently on his shoulder. Silas snapped awake, already reaching for the rifle. "They're coming," she whispered, her breath warm against his skin. Outside, far across the open plain, a long, low plume of dust uncoiled like a serpent. Riders. Thorn. And this time, he brought war. 12 men, maybe more. Cutter rode at his side, scar glittering like a brand beneath the sun. The others were mercenaries, rough-saddled, long-barreled, drunk on the promise of stolen gold. They approached the ranch like butchers eyeing a lamb. What they saw was a cabin, one man, easy prey. They saw nothing of the fire in Lila, nothing of the steel in Silas. The first shot rang out, not from the cabin, but from the rocks above. Thorn's lead scout, the one riding point, dropped like a stone, rifle clattering beside him. His horse screamed and bolted. Chaos, shouts, riders fanning out, some ducking for cover, others wheeling back in panic. Then came the second crack. Another man tumbled from his saddle, landing hard near the creek bed. The rest scrambled. Silas chambered another round, eyes cold, heart steady. Below, Lila waited in the barn's shadow, bow in hand, quiet and invisible in the half-light. She moved like water through dry grass, her face painted in ash and charcoal, breath slow and measured. They were no longer just a man and a woman. They were a unit, and this was their land now. From the woods came the rustle of boots, the hiss of commands. Thorne's voice, sharp and clipped, trying to regain control. Too late. Cutter stepped onto the path toward the barn and triggered the tripwire. A cluster of rocks cascaded from the ridge above, burying him in dust and blood. He roared, wounded, not dead but shaken. The illusion of invincibility cracked. Silas fired again. The men faltered. They had expected a lamb, but the lamb had grown fangs. The fire crackled low that evening as twilight swallowed the canyon in hues of amber and charcoal. Smoke from the burial pyre still lingered, curling like ghosts into the indigo sky. Lila sat cross-legged near the edge of the bluff, her silhouette sharp against the horizon, the wind playing with the strands of hair that had come loose from her braid. Silas stood a few feet behind her, silent, letting her have this moment. He knew she was Navajo, her blood tied to a people from further north, her tongue seasoned with a softer dialect, but her spirit carried the same fire as the ancestors she mourned. She didn't need to belong to a specific tribe to feel the ache of land desecrated, of honor tarnished, of silence broken by men who mistook decency for weakness. This land, though new to her, had called to her bones, just as she had called something long buried within him. Silas took off his hat, holding it over his heart as she sang a second verse, her voice rising strong and unwavering into the dusk. He didn't know the words, but he felt them, deep and real. They echoed inside him, remembrance, resistance, rebirth. When the song ended, she sat in stillness for a long while. Finally, she spoke, without turning. He said, "I'd never make it out here." Her voice was quiet, like the wind whispering through cottonwood. Said I was too soft, too proud, too full of spirit that couldn't be tamed. Silas came to her side and sat down, his knees creaking, his rifle leaning on a stone nearby. "Who?" "My stepfather." She paused. "The man who raised me after my mother died. He thought he was protecting me, keeping me from wild dreams." She smiled faintly. "But it wasn't protection. It was fear, his fear, of what I might become without chains." Silas stared out into the endless land. "You're more than he ever knew." "No." Her eyes turned to him, then unflinching, dark as rich soil, full of stories that hadn't yet been told. "And you? Why did you stay out here so long? What kept you buried in silence?" He hesitated. Then the truth rose, uncoiling slowly like a serpent warmed by firelight. "Because it was easier than remembering. I lost my brother to this land. A skirmish gone wrong. Too much pride. Too many enemies. I stayed because out here, no one asks you to explain why you stopped believing in tomorrow." "No." Lila reached out and placed her hand gently over his. "But today, you did believe. You fought for me. For this place." Silas looked down at her fingers, rough from work, strong from survival, but warm tender in a way that caught him off guard. "You gave me a reason." A long silence settled between them, not uncomfortable, but weighted full of all that had passed and all that now stretched ahead. The night grew cooler, stars scattering across the velvet dome above, their reflection flickering in the dark water near the cabin. Later, they moved inside. The cabin bore the scars of battle blood on the doorframe, a shattered pane, a trail of boots long fled. But it also bore the heat of the hearth, the memory of laughter, the ghost of a home waiting to be remade. Silas poured water into a basin, kneeling beside Lila to clean a shallow graze on her arm. His fingers were surprisingly gentle. "Do you regret it?" she asked. He looked up, startled. "Regret what?" "Saving me, killing for me." He met her gaze, and there was no shadow in his eyes now, only the hard-earned clarity of a man who had wandered in the dark too long. "I regret not finding you sooner." She studied him, not as a man, not as a savior, but as a human being whose heart had been asleep and now stirred with something fierce and unfamiliar. "You don't owe me anything," she said quietly. I know, he replied, but I still want to stay, if you'll have me. The words hung between them like a prayer. Lila stood then, walked to the small window where the moon hung like a sentinel. We'll rebuild the barn first. The roof leaks. Then we'll mend the fence line. You'll teach me how to set traps that won't catch the neighbor's dogs. Silas chuckled. And you'll teach me how to cook something other than beans and regret. No. She turned, and her grin was radiant. Deal. Days passed, then weeks. The canyon began to breathe again. Grass grew where blood had once spilled. Birds returned to nest in the rafters. Lila's laughter, rare at first, came easier. She spoke of her passed-off snowy mountains, of a little sister lost to sickness, of nights spent dreaming of something bigger than the confines of her old life. Silas shared stories of his mother's songs, of horses that once ran like lightning, of a younger version of himself who'd believed in peace but been broken by war. They repaired the porch together, side by side, built a smokehouse, found an old map with a trail to a spring that hadn't run dry. Every task, no matter how small, bound them closer. And one evening, as they sat by the fire with a cup of strong coffee between them, Lila rested her head against his shoulder. This place, she murmured, it doesn't feel like exile anymore. He touched her hair gently. That's because it isn't. There were still dangers beyond the ridgeman like Thorne, who thought strength meant cruelty, that land was theirs by right, that silence was consent. But Silas and Lila no longer walked alone. They were rooted now, like twin trees grown from the same scarred earth. One morning, after a long ride into the hills to check the stock, they paused on the crest of a slope, looking out over the valley bathed in early light. It's yours now, Silas said softly. She shook her head. It's ours. He smiled, feeling something bloom in his chest he hadn't felt in decades. Hope. Real, breathing hope. She turned in the saddle, looking at him with that same blaze in her eyes he had seen when she first rose from the barn shadows. Tell me the truth, Silas Cade. If we had met under different skies. We didn't, he interrupted. We met under the ones that mattered. Their horses stepped forward, side by side, toward the cabin nestled like a promise below. And though they knew storms would come again as they always do in wild places, they also knew now that love, once awakened, was the greatest frontier of all. Together, they had survived. Together, they would endure. And in the quiet, in the beauty, in the hard-won peace of that forgotten canyon, they would write the rest of their story. One sunrise at a time. Their story was never meant to make headlines or echo through ballads sung in prairie saloon. No one carved their names into history books, and no monument would mark the place where it all began. Just a modest cabin tucked between the hills and the hush of wind threading through tall grass. But what Silas and Lila found in that forgotten corner of the frontier was something rare. A love forged not in fantasy, but in pain, fire, and the quiet choice to stay when it would have been easier to walk away. Silas hadn't set out to find love. He had wandered the West with too many scars on his body, sure, but worse, in the hollows of his heart. The war had taken too much, and what it left behind was a man who trusted no one, who spoke little, and who made peace with silence better than with people. But then came Lila. Lila didn't belong to this place. She wasn't Comanche, nor settler, nor outlaw. She was something else entirely, a survivor, a watcher, a woman who had walked through fire more than once and learned to do so without leaving a trail. She didn't speak much at first, didn't ask questions, didn't try to tame him, but she listened, she saw. And slowly, Silas found himself seen in a way he had long forgotten was possible. Their love didn't arrive like a storm. It came more like the seasons inevitable, subtle, shifting everything without fanfare. It lived in small gestures, the way she placed a mug beside his elbow without asking if he was thirsty, or the way his hand found her waist when she passed by him in the narrow kitchen. It grew in the silences between them, not empty, but full of understanding, of shared weight, of trust born in the quiet. They both carried ghosts. Lila sometimes stared at the sky as if expecting it to fall. Silas flinched in his sleep and never spoke of what haunted him. But now they had each other, someone to hold the shadows with, someone to witness the ache without demanding it be named. And maybe that was what made it real. Not perfection, not promises, but presence. They stayed together, not because it was easy or safe, but because they had chosen, again and again, to turn toward one another when the world turned cold. In a land carved by violence, they built something human, a life, a home, a fire that never quite went out. And sometimes, that's all a love story ever really needs. But love, like the land they lived on, was never still. It shifted beneath their feet, like the brittle crust of drought-thirsty earth or the soft crumble of snow after thaw. And even as the seasons turned, and the cabin filled with the scent of cedarwood smoke and coffee grounds, there were days when silence returned not as comfort but as a test. There were mornings when Silas would stare out the window long after dawn, hands unmoving around a tin cup gone cold. His body sat in the room, but his mind drifted somewhere else to the ghost town of his memories, to faces lost in the smoke of war. Lila would watch him, not with impatience, but with the gentle ache of knowing she could not follow him there. She never tried. Instead, she would hum. Always the same low, quiet melody, some tune she said her mother sang when nights grew long and winters unforgiving. It was a song made of soil and sorrow, and it seemed to remind the walls that someone still lived here, someone still hoped. And slowly, Silas would blink himself back. His fingers would twitch, his breath would deepen. He would turn toward her, eyes storm dark, and she would smile, not wide, not bright, but soft. True, on her darker days, it was Lila who would slip into silence. She would stand by the back door with her arms crossed, watching the trees sway as if waiting for them to reveal something, a sign, a path, maybe a past version of herself she'd long buried. There were scars on her back that Silas had only seen once, the night she let him undress her slowly, wordlessly, beneath the wavering lantern light. He never asked, she never explained. Instead, he wrapped his arms around her from behind, pressing his lips to the base of her neck, grounding her not with answers, but with presence. That was their rhythm, a slow, aching dance of two broken souls who never asked for rescue, only a witness. Some nights, they would sit outside on the front steps, boots off, feet dusted in soil and ash. Coyotes howled in the distance, and the stars spilled across the sky like scattered silver coins. Lila would lean her head on Silas's shoulder, and he would rest his cheek against her hair. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. But one night, after months of such stillness, she finally said it. "I never thought I'd live long enough to feel safe." Silas didn't answer right away. He just reached for her hand, thumb tracing the calloused pads of her fingers, as if trying to memorize the map of her survival. "You are," he said eventually. "With me, you are." And for the first time in years, she believed it. They built more than just a life, they built rituals. On Sundays, they would trade stories, even if some were half true or made up entirely. On Thursdays, Lila would bake, her hair tied up with an old blue ribbon Silas had once found tangled in a fence post. On rainy days, they would drag the mattress closer to the fireplace and read aloud to each other, stumbling through the words like children learning the sound of their own hearts. Their love wasn't loud. It wasn't poetic. It was ordinary in the most sacred, defiant way. In a world that had tried to unmake them, to silence them, to erase them, they chose to remain. To wake each morning and say, without saying, "I see you, I stay." One winter, Lila caught fever. It came fast, like a thief in the night. Her skin burned, and her breath grew thin, and Silas sat by her bedside for 3 days straight, refusing food, refusing rest. He whispered to her stories, prayers, promises. He read from a torn book they'd found at an abandoned trading post, something about wolves and daughters in mountains that never bowed. On the 4th morning, her fever broke. When she opened her eyes and saw him slumped over the bed, face streaked with tears and ash, she reached for him and said, barely audible, "You stayed." He only nodded, choking on the words he didn't know how to say. Years later, when gray threaded through his beard and her hands began to shake when she poured water, their love remained steady, not young, not wild, but rooted. They had planted a garden that fed no one but themselves. They had written no vows and held no ceremony, but the land remembered them, the wind carried the shape of their laughter, and the stones beneath their home stayed warm long after they were gone. And in the way of quiet legends, theirs endured not in stories told around fires, but in the soil, in the worn steps of the porch, in the wildflowers that returned every spring by the fence line. Because some love stories aren't meant to be told, they're meant to be lived. And Silas and Lila, they lived together, completely, quietly, always.